All right, y'all. So we're going to revisit a topic that, for those of you who have been on the channel for the last couple of years, since I've been posting videos on this platform, you'll know that my very first video series on this platform was on the Vikings and the fact that, yes, there were so-called Black Vikings. And not only were there so-called Black Vikings, but, or so-called Negroid Vikings, but the very first Vikings, or really more properly, the first Scandinavians who hailed mainly from Sweden and Denmark, were so-called Black. And before I move forward, let me just say this, because for a lot of people, especially a lot of so-called Caucasians from Europe, mainly from the northern areas in Europe, especially, of course, Scandinavia, will still to this day, 2 years later, come onto my channel and allege that I'm trying to quote unquote steal their history and culture by claiming the Vikings were so-called Black. But let me just state that once again, yes, there were so-called Black Vikings from Denmark and Sweden, because I know I'll have people come in the comments saying that there were no Black Vikings at all whatsoever, and the only instance where there could have been a so-called Black or even just a dark-skinned person who was claimed to be a Viking was in the case of a man by the name of Geirmund, who was stated to have quote-unquote Black or dark skin, but half of his familial line didn't even go back to Scandinavian roots, because he was part, I believe, Semiotic or Mongolian, and also half Norwegian. So the assertion that most people make was that he was not actually a so-called Black man, and that he was just a darker skinned man due to his Mongolian roots. And allegedly this was the figure in quote unquote Viking history that was even remotely close to being a Black Viking, because but the reality is that, once again, most of these Scandinavians who hailed from mainly Denmark and Sweden were so-called Black. But there was also so-called Caucasians as well. Okay, there was definitely documentation, both modern and medieval, that exists of the existence of so-called Caucasian Vikings. So yes, there were quote unquote white or Caucasian Vikings who mainly hailed from a region in Scandinavia that we'll see in a minute here. But yes, there were Caucasian Scandinavian Vikings, but the bulk of the original Vikings who established petty kingdoms all over Europe, and of course Scandinavia, but also in England, Ireland, the place that we know of today as Russia, and various other parts in Europe, those people were so-called Black, believe it or not. And by the end of this video series, where I'm going to go into even more depth than I did in my original series on this topic. But by the end of this series, it will be clear and undeniable that the original peoples of Scandinavia, at least during the medieval time period, and even before the medieval time period, the original peoples of places like Finland and even the northern parts of Sweden, Norway, and Russia, who were known as the Laplanders. Yeah, those people were so-called Black as well. The original Laplanders, not the people who identify as that nomenclature today, but the originals were in fact so-called Black. So we'll see all of this by the time I end this series. And before I get started, I just want to state that the reason for me revisiting this topic is so that it can act as a precursor to the medieval European dynasties that will be going over, primarily first in England, but really all over Europe. Because for those of you who don't know, the Vikings were the ancestors of the vast majority of the dynastic families in Europe, primarily in places like England, France, Scotland, Ireland, and then to a degree Russia and Wales. And their influence spread all across these European countries. Most of the kings in Europe, but specifically England, since that is the place we'll focus on the most at first when I start talking about the medieval European dynasties. But most of the kings, the queens, the dukes, the lords, the earls, noble families, etc. Most of those people descended from the Vikings through a group of people known to history as the Normans. And they will be the topic of discussion after we finish this series on the Vikings. But the Normans were mainly comprised of a lot of these so-called Black Vikings that hailed from Denmark. And of course, this descent from the Danish Vikings would have reverberations on all the way on down to the nobility, and all of the European countries that I just listed the Vikings had influence on, and particularly the figure known in Norman history as Rollo, who was the progenitor of pretty much every king of England from 1066 on down to the end of the Stuart line in 1714. Okay, but again, those will be their own individual series that I'll be making coming down the pike. But this is why it is essential for me to go over the Vikings again before I go over any European ruling dynasty, because they will set the tone for understanding that medieval Europe was in fact primarily ruled over by so-called Blacks for most of the medieval time period into the Renaissance time period. But in order to do that, of course, I have to prove, or should I say, I have to prove again that the Vikings, who I stated were so-called black, once again, primarily the Danish and Swedish Vikings, were actually, as such, they were actually so-called black. So let's get into this by first looking at a name that was given to the Danes and a certain sect of the Swedes by a group of people who saw and witnessed their brutal raiding tactics firsthand, since they were the ones being attacked. During what is known to history as the quote-unquote Viking Age, the so-called Vikings raided and pillaged various different areas in Europe, mainly starting in areas like the British Isles, places like England, Scotland, Ireland, and even Wales. One of the first ever Viking raids was documented as taking place in England and one of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms known as Northumbria, in their religious capital of Northumberland. They attacked a monastery known as the Monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 and killed most of the monks or took them as slaves, while also taking a lot of their gold and other wealth that the Vikings could get their hands on. And then the second documented attack came in 795 at another monastery in Iona, which is in Scotland, where they did a lot of the same they committed a lot of the same acts that they did in England. And then there was another attack in 795, but this time it was in Ireland at the Isle of Lambay. There was a group of mainly, I believe, Norwegian Vikings who raided and looted another monastery in that isle. And then following after that, there was attack with raids that came off the coast of a island in Ireland known as Brega in 798. And then in 807, they attacked another isle known as Connacht. And then there were much later attempts made on the country of Wales, starting at around 850, where they attempted to invade the islands of Anglesey and Gwynedd, but they were ultimately resisted by the Welsh king Rhodri Mar. And then much later raids were made, most famously in England, in and around the 860s, as well as many more and then there were more raids that were made within Europe and other places in Europe. But while all of this was going on, of course, there were many witnesses to these events from the various different countries they raided, who documented what they saw the Vikings doing and a lot of the vile and brutal things they saw them doing in their country. But many of these chroniclers didn't just explain in great detail what they saw the Vikings doing, but a lot of them made no bones about describing what these so-called Vikings looked like as well. And this is, of course, where it starts to get controversial. The interpretation of the words that were used to describe two of the main groups of Vikings that were raiding these countries in the British Isles. These two groups were comprised mainly of the Norwegian and Danish castes of Vikings, with the Norwegians being the main ones who raided Ireland and Scotland, and the Danes being the ones that raided England and later Ireland as well, where they had disputes with the Norwegians over who had the right to rule certain areas of Ireland that they had conquered. And it is from this area within Europe during the height of the raids during the Viking Age where we'll see just one of the names that will help us gain an understanding of how the Vikings were described. Let's take a look at what this term was real quick. All right, so to start this off, we're going to look at two terms that the Danish and Norwegian Vikings were called, and the two terms that I'm referring to can be seen at the very top of this Wikipedia page. The two terms are Dub Gaul and Finn Gaul, okay? So these terms, these were the two words that the peoples of Ireland who saw the Vikings used to describe them. Now we're going to read a couple of paragraphs from this Wikipedia entry to get a little bit of understanding of what these words mean and how they were used to describe the Vikings, and we'll just start at the very top of this first paragraph right here. So Dub Gaul and Finn Gaul, or Dub Ginty and Finn Ginty, are Middle Irish terms used to denote different rival groups of Vikings in Ireland and Britain. Literally, Dub/Finn Gaul is translated as dark and fair foreigners or black and white foreigners. And similarly, Dub/Finn Ginty, dark/black and fair/white heathens. Okay, so remember how this entry states right here, the terms Dub and Finn Gaul or Finn Ginty originally meant or were meant to indicate color terms like black or dark or even fair and white. Okay, so just remember that as we go along, because this article does what the vast majority of people who try to interpret, albeit falsely interpret, what these two terms were meant to indicate when they were used to describe the Vikings who were raiding them. But anyway, similar terms are found in Welsh chronicles, probably derived from Gaelic usage. The first known use of these terms in the chronicles is from 851, when it noted that the Dub Gaul arrived in Cleath or Dublin and made a great slaughter of the Fionn Gael. All right, so that gives us a general understanding of what the two terms dub and Fingal or Ginty mean. And again, I want you guys to keep in mind what these terms mean and how they were used used, because it will be essential to us figuring out what we need to find out pertaining to the Vikings and how they were designated by color according to the Irish and other British chroniclers at the time. So now let's go down a little bit in the excerpt to take a look at what exact sector of the Vikings that were raiding the British Isles during this time period were designated as Dub and Fingal. So let's start where it says the identification. So the identification of Fingal as Norwegian and Dubgal as Danish has a long tradition, but it was first made long after the terms fell out of contemporary use. Okay, so we see here that it clearly states Fingal equated to the Norwegian Viking raiders and Dubgal equated to the Danish ones. Okay, so once again, remember that as we move forward and see even more why the Danes were referred to as Dubgal, and even a little bit later on Dub Ginty. But I want to finish reading the rest of this paragraph before I move on. According to Smith, the oldest Irish source that equates Dub with Danes is the 12th century Kogad Gadel Reg Galiab, who speaks of Danish black Gentiles, Dub Ginty Denarda. So again, remember that Dub is equal to black or dark, and Fin was equal to fair or white. And we'll see this from actual Irish sources in a little bit here, that this was indeed true, because a lot of modern day historians have tried to make it a rule of thumb that the terms used for these sects of Vikings were more referring to other things that had nothing to do with physical characteristics. So we'll see that in a little bit. But reading on, it says, Downham points out that the last contemporary use of the terms may be Chronicum Scotorum sub anno 941. According to Smith, medieval Irish writers and later Gaelic antiquaries such as Dub-Altag Mac Frishbig or Frishsig. Please bear with me with these Irish terms because I don't read Irish very well. And Geoffrey Keating were clear on overall Norwegian origin of the Fingal and the Danish origin of the Dubgal. Smith also states that it is clear from references to Scandinavian activity of the 9th and 10th century within Ireland that white foreigners have predominantly Norwegian origin and that their opposites were Danes. So we'll stop right there, and you guys should get the point from this excerpt in regards to who these two terms apply to, and somewhat of how they were used to describe the Norwegians and the Danes. But again, we'll see later on from actual Irish sources what these terms meant. But now let's move on and look at one more source that will give us an understanding of what these designations of Dub and Fin Ginty meant, or Dub and Fingal meant, and how they were applied to both the Danes and the Norwegians. All right, so now this is a scholarly Irish magazine from the mid-1800s. So let's read what this has to say about the designations that were given to the Danish and Norwegian Vikings and what they were meant to entail. And we'll start at page 310. So O'Reilly says that Dubgal signified a Dane. Okay, so again, Dubgal was a phrase that was meant to refer to the Danes. So that should already be understood by now. But reading on, it says a little examination will bring us some steps towards the origin of this particular meaning. In English history, the general names of Danes, they have been known as Northmen or Normans. So that's pretty revelatory because it helps us understand, and even will help us to understand later on in other series what this term Norman was in reference to when it talks about the Normans that came from Normandy to England in 1066. And what their origins were. Again, like I stated earlier, the Normans and their leader, the first Duke of Normandy, who was named Rollo, were of Danish or quote unquote Dub-Gaul descent. Okay, but that's something we'll see again in another series, as well as even a little bit later on in this video. But let's get back to what this has to say. So, when sometimes Osman or Easterlings, but we are told they are rarely and not till a later period, thus designated in our native annals by Tigernot, the earliest existing annalist. They are invariably called Gaul or strangers, while in the annals of Innisfallen of Ulster and of the Four Masters, they are styled indifferently Gauls, Gentiles, dwellers on the lakes, or pirates. But in not more than 2 or 3 instances are they called Normans, and as seldom Danes. So again, it equates Normans and Danes together as being basically the same thing. Okay, so but reading on, the name Loch Lanark, which more here translates a low or arm of the sea, as well as lake and lawn or Lanark, strong, and we apprehend those we apprehend those are the true roots, although we find also Lundog, an abiding countenance, dwelling. The compounds of the name indicate to us the distinctive meaning of the term, which has led us to the present inquiry, for we find that Dub Lok or Dub Lanok, or black man strong at sea, signifies a Dane or inhabitant of Denmark proper. Okay, so here is yet another name that the Danes were referred to as. They were referred to as Dub Loks or Dub Lok Lanoks, if I'm not mistaken, which according to this translation by a very well-known 19th century Irish writer by the name of Thomas More, this word in Irish translates to black man strong at sea. Okay, but let's hold off on the speculation as to what this could mean for now, because we will definitely get a definitive answer of the meaning behind the myriad of different names the Vikings were called during the Viking Age and what they meant. Okay, but now let's skip down and just read a little bit more about from this excerpt. So starting at where it says Harris says, so Harris says that this denomination, Dub Gaul, is not preserved in history that we know of, but it remains by tradition among the native Irish of these parts to this day. More, however, corrects him and says the writer would have found in the annals of the Four Masters the name Dub Gaul applied to these strangers, while in the annals of Innisfallen and of Ulster they are styled Dub Ginty or Black Gentiles, and the other Fionn Ginty or White Gentiles. The distinction by color between the Norwegians and Danes probably is much greater in antiquity than their invasion of Ireland. And we'll stop here. So, but just to mention something that you guys may or may not have noticed from the last section of this excerpt, there was a historian, the one who had the last name Harris, who was trying to out and out lie and say that the term Dub Gaul was not in existence in Irish historical annals, even though he admits a little bit afterwards that the Irish of his time period acknowledged that the nomenclature, or that this nomenclature was a part of their traditional history as it pertains to their history with the Danes. And then, of course, Thomas More corrects him and cites the multitude of different Irish historical chronicles from that time period that mention the existence of the so-called Dub Gaul and even Dub Ginty and their history. So what that should show us right there is that the Caucasian, even from around the time period of the 19th century, or whenever this historian made the statement he made about the alleged non-existence of the term Dub Gaul in Irish history, is that the Caucasian was still trying to lie about the existence of so-called dark complexion Vikings by attempting to omit that term Dub Gaul from history, because they know what that term implied when that term Dub Gaul was given to the Danes, and even other terms that this excerpt cites, like Dub Lachlan or Dub Lachlan, which signified a native of Denmark or a Dane and meant quite literally black man strong at sea. Right, so we should get the point by now, though, of how the Danes were referred to as Dub, followed by words that meant foreigner, Gentiles, sea rovers, Northmen, Normans, right, etc. So it should go without saying that anytime we see this term Dub in reference to the Scandinavians, it is referring to primarily the Danes and even a sect of the Swedes that we'll see later on. But this term Dub indicates the Danes, and the word Dub, as we've seen a few times thus far, was a word from the Gaelic Irish language that meant quite literally black or dark in most instances. And this is why we've seen a few examples of the Danes being referred to as the quote-unquote black Gentiles and even the black or dark foreigners. But modern day scholars would try to assert that the term Dub in reference to the Danes was not meant to indicate color, but was meant to indicate that they were a quote-unquote new group of Vikings that arrived mainly in Ireland, as opposed to the quote-unquote old Vikings that had conquered a lot of the lands in Ireland, which were supposedly the Norwegians. And scholars will try to assert that the words Dub and Finn were meant to be metaphorical terms in case of the term Dub, they have tried to allege that the term Dub primarily just meant gloomy, melancholy, and even great and mighty. And then allegedly the word Finn was meant to indicate that the Irish were calling the Norwegians handsome, just, and or true. And when you look at the context of what was going on between the Viking raiders and the Irish during this time period, none of these other words really make any sense. It doesn't make much sense at all whatsoever to call a group of people who raided, pillaged, killed, and took people as slaves from your own country, and even raped other people or raped women from your country. It doesn't make much sense to call them handsome or just or true. So that can't be the correct translation. New and old would make more sense if the terms Dub and Finn ever meant new and old to begin with, but they never did. You can take a look at any Irish dictionary and see that the definitions of these two words never indicated any denotation of something being new or old. And then when you look at Irish dictionaries such as this one right here, we can clearly see that this dictionary defines the word dub as black, dark, and then it gives other words like dub dawn, which means dark brown, and then also dub the adok, which means having black teeth. So this word dub does indeed denote black and dark, despite what we see underneath this first definition of dub, which keep in mind is the primary definition of dub, this first one that we just read. But underneath it, it states that the term dub also could mean great or prodigious, which is one of the words modern scholars state that the word dub allegedly could have indicated instead of something having to do with color. But that definition doesn't make any sense when we take a look at how the term Finn was defined and what it meant and what was most likely implied when it was used for the Norwegians. But we'll see that in a couple minutes here when we look at the definitions for Finn in a little bit here. But here is yet another definition for the word dub from an Irish dictionary, and yet again we see here that dub is defined first and foremost as black or dark, and then once again underneath dub we see the word great. But again, I'll get into why great being applied to the word dub in the context of when the Irish use it to describe the Vikings doesn't make any sense. But once again, dub denotes black, and then here is just one last definition for the word dub from an online Gaelic to English dictionary, and we see yet again dub mainly means black, dark, and then the third definition is sad, and then above it it gives a second series of definitions for dub, and no surprise they are centered around the color black, literally denoting or defining dub as black, and then even blackness, darkness, ink, which of course when one thinks of the color ink you think of black, and then pupil of the eye, which mainly for most people is the color black. But we get the point. The term dub equates to black or dark, so it's safe to say that the Danish Vikings, who raided various places within the British Isles such as Ireland, England, Wales, Scotland, etc., they were referred to by the chroniclers that were in these lands as Dub Gaul or Dub Genty because they were being called black strangers or black Gentiles. They were not referred to as dub because of them being called great or prodigious or gloomy or melancholy or even quote unquote new strangers or quote unquote new foreigners. And none of the Irish dictionary definitions that I pulled from did dub in any of these dictionary definitions mean new. So that explanation is out of the window. But for those of you who may be saying that the other alternative definitions like gloomy or great or melancholy could apply to the word dub, still in reference to which could be in reference to the Danish Vikings who were raiding the British Isles, please consider that the other term that was given to the other set of Vikings who raided the British Isles, of course the Norwegians, which was Finn, in most Irish Gaelic dictionaries meant simply just white. So here in this Irish to English dictionary, we can see that Finn or Fionn is defined as white and milk, which of course milk is the color of white. And in this dictionary, Finn or Fionn is defined in the same way. So this term Finn or Fionn undoubtedly meant white and was meant to indicate something that was white in the Irish Gaelic language. So this is why I stated earlier that the other words that were included in the definition for dub didn't make any sense, or at least not as much sense as the word black being what was implied when the Danes were called dub, in contrast to the Norwegians who were called Finn or Fionn, which meant white. So that dichotomy in between the two groups based on color makes the most sense and is the most probable, since the two primary definitions for dub and Finn mean black and white respectively. So the most likely answer to what dub Gaul and Finn Gaul were meant to indicate for the Danish and Norwegian Vikings that were ravaging Ireland and the other countries within the British Isles was that they were both terms that referred to these two groups of Vikings as black and white. So now that we have that answer, let's talk about yet another problem that most people have when trying to find out what was specifically implied by these two terms, dub Gaul and Finn Gaul, and the main questions people tend to ask, which is that if dub Gaul and Finn Gaul meant black and white strangers, what was specifically being referred to as black or white or even fair? Was it their armor? Did one raiding party have black armor and the other one have white armor or lighter armor? Or was it even their banner color? Did one army have a black banner and the other one a white banner? And then we get down to the physical characteristics such as hair. You get a lot of people who tend to state that the words dub and Fionn were applied to these two Viking raiding parties strictly because of their hair color, with the Danes being the black-haired ones and the Norwegians being the light or quote-unquote fair-haired ones. And the thing with that is that for number one, the same people who state that the Danes were being called dub for their hair color and it being black are the same ones who say that the Danes for the most part are had red hair. So they'll change that goalpost in avert the conversation away from another physical characteristic the Danes and Norwegians could have had, as was evidenced by the definitions of the terms that were applied to them. Because how is it that the Danes could have been black-haired and been described as such by a multitude of different chroniclers from different countries who documented the incumbency of numerous different Viking raiding parties or raiding armies, when according to certain people, again, the Danish Vikings supposedly had red hair as a whole. But another thing is that the words dub and fin, even though they are words that do or can mean black and fair hair, can both also be used to reference skin color as well. Just going back to the word fin, again, fin is a word that meant fair or light, and it can be in reference to hair color, but it can also be in reference to skin color as well. And we can look at references from like this entry on etymology.com that shows us that the etymology of the word fin, or in its other form, fionn, is as it reads, fionn, white, also fair of complexion or hair. Okay, so we see here that the word fionn or fin can mean fair or light hair, or light complexion, according to this website's definition. And so now looking at another definition from the Word Sense Dictionary, we can see the word fionn or fin, when used as an adjective, can refer to a person's hair or their complexion. And even under the Scottish Gaelic definition, fionn is still defined as fair of hair and complexion. So this once again confirms that what I've been saying about the definition of fin, indicating not only hair but complexion as well. And just to give one last piece of evidence of this, here is the word fin from an online Irish Gaelic language dictionary, and going over to its definition, we can see that one of the definitions for fin is pretty much the same as the others we just saw. It reads fair, light hued, of complexion, hair, etc. So once more, yes, the term fin could in fact imply skin color and not just hair color. So that brings us back to the word dub. Now that we know that one of the words that was used to describe the Norwegians' raiding party could imply skin color, why wouldn't it be the same for the Danes' raiding party when they were referred to as dub Gauls or dub Genti? And this is the problem that most people have, that I've personally seen, whether it be on my channel or some other platform or just other forums discussing this particular topic in general have, and that's that the understanding most detractors against the notion that a large portion of the so-called Vikings were called dub Gauls or dub Genti, or referred to as such because of their dark skin complexion. A lot of them don't want to admit this because they know that it goes against the notion that all of the Vikings were these blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned race of people, which is the preferred image of the Vikings in most people's eyes. Most would have people believe that the way the people on that AMC show, The Vikings, looked is how every last Viking and even Scandinavian person looked back during the Viking Age. And it's understandable because when you look at the composition of the Scandinavian countries today, like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, the vast majority of the people there are in fact pale-skinned and blonde/red-haired and blue-eyed Caucasians. So, of course, the natural association with the Scandinavian lands is that it's always been inhabited by people who looked like the modern-day inhabitants of that land today. So for all of these reasons is why scholars and just people in general who, again, I see under my comments and other forums discussing this issue in general, tend to stray away from the possibility of the words that were used by the Irish to denote the Danes from it ever applying to their skin color. But like I stated earlier, during this time period of raiding, pillaging, and conquering other lands within Europe, during the so-called Viking Age, the Vikings were given various different names, even names that were disparate from the two main ones that most people cite when speaking about the Vikings and how they were described. And one of these names that was given to the Vikings, particularly, of course, again, the Danes, will help us understand, or will help us find out if the Danes were really called black foreigners or black Gentiles because of their hair or their armor or some other mitigating explanation, or if they were simply called these various nomenclatures that translated to black because it denoted their skin color. So let's see what this particular name was that was given to the Vikings by the people of medieval Britain. All right, so this is a rendition of a 9th century monk by the name of Ninnius's Historia Britannium, which was a historical chronicle that he wrote. And so let's read a passage from one of the footnotes in this book that was written by the editor to see what one of the other names the Danes were referred to as. during their raids in the British Isles. So we'll start at the years 851 and 850, or 850 and 851. So the 850 and 851 witnessed bloody battles in Leinster between the Finn Gent and Dub Gent, of which the last was continued for 3 days and nights. The Danes, who afterwards ravaged Strickland and North Wales, were called by the Britons Gwyr Duan and Paganid Duan, although their language was not the word Finn. Okay, so we see this footnote gives us two names the Danes were referred to as by the Britons, but the only one we're going to focus on is the first one it gives, which is Gwyr Duan. And so in order to understand what this word meant, let's go about looking at a translation at the very same Welsh Chronicle this footnote cites from. If you guys can see, it cites the Welsh Chronicle, which is translated as the Chronicles of the Princes of Wales. So let's take a look at how this term Gwyr Duan was translated by that chronicle. All right, so now let's take a look at this excerpt from this Welsh Chronicle, which I believe was made around 682 and continued to be added onto well into the 13th century. So this chronicle and the ones who wrote it definitely would have kept track of what the Vikings looked like at the time, since it was created around the so-called Viking Age when the Vikings were still in the process of raiding and pillaging within the British Isles. So now let's see real quick here what this chronicle translates the word Gwyr Duan to mean. As we can see it right here, you can see the words Gwyr Duan clearly there. So let's see how this translates Gwyr Duan. So Gwyr Duan, according to this chronicle, is equivalent in English to black men. Okay, so Gwyr Duan translates to black men according to this Welsh Chronicle. So now that we know this, we can confirm two things. One being that the original names I showed the Danes being called, which were of course Dub Genti and Dub Gaul, which I stated the translation of those words were black, followed by Gentile or foreigner, and not some other word that indicated anything else other than that were correct in how they were translated. But also, the Danes had to have been referred to as black or black men for a reason, and that reason most likely had to do with some sort of physical characteristic the Danes possessed as a whole. I think it's also important to note that this chronicle is completely separate from the statements that were made by the Irish and English when they called the Danes Dub Gaul and Dub Genti, which of course translates to the Danes being referred to as so-called black as well. So this was a common occurrence all throughout the British Isles by different people in different countries and even at different time periods. So the fact that the Danes were called quote unquote black by these various distinct sources should let you know that however this term black was used and whatever it was referring to was something that all of the Danish Vikings possessed as a whole. But going back to what I said about this term black that we keep seeing popping up, I referenced to in reference to the Danes and how it certainly is referencing a certain physical characteristic they had. This is definitely something that becomes more feasible when again you take a look at the definitions I gave of what the other Viking horde that raided the land of Ireland along with the Danes was called and how that word was defined. The word Finn or Fionn, which is what the Norwegians were called, was defined as something or someone that is either fair or light in complexion or hair, right? So if the Norwegians were referred to as Finn or fair Gentiles, which presumably was in reference to their hair or skin color, or even both at the time, why wouldn't the Danes, who were of course called Dub, which meant literally black, have been referred to as such because of their physical features and characteristics such as their hair color or skin color or even both as well? So this is indeed the case, and many different scholars from the 18th and 19th centuries knew this to be true themselves. So let's take a look at what a few of them had to say regarding the reasoning for why the Danes were so often called quote unquote black. And actually, before we get into that, I just want to take a look at how else that term Gwyr Duan could be defined according to a very well-known, during his time, Welsh historian by the name of Sir Owen Morgan Edwards. So the author of this book being Welsh, as well as him being a highly renowned historian, makes this translation of the word Gwyr Duan very credible. So let's read what he has to say here regarding the meaning of the word Gwyr Duan as it was used in reference to the Danes. So Englishmen are called Saison and Gwyr Sensig, the last being an adjective. During the earlier times after the Norman conquest of England in AD 1066, the natives of Wales called the Normans Francod. They always called the Danes the swarthy men. literally Guer Duan. Okay, so we can see here that that according to Sir Owen Edwards, the term Guer Duan can also be translated as swarthy men. And for those of you who have been on this channel for long enough, you know that the term swarthy, for number one, when used to describe someone, is always in reference to their skin color. But not only that, the term swarthy and the skin color that was associated with that term ranged from medium brown complexion to a so-called black or very dark complexion or dark brown complexion. And that term swarthy in its most ancient form of swart or swert did simply just mean black. So swarthy does correlate with the word black, which is how Guer Duan was originally translated as. Here's one example right here from etymology.com of the definition of swarthy. And we can see here it states dark colored, tawny, especially in reference to skin, right? An unexplained alteration of swarthy from swart plus y. And then we go to the word swart, which is where this word swarthy comes from, and it's defined as Old English swart, black, being of a dark hue, in reference to night clouds, also figurative, wicked, infamous, from Proto-Germanic swarta of Old Frisian, Old Saxon, and Middle Dutch zwart, Dutch zwart, Old Norse zwarter, German schwarz, Gothic swart, dark colored, black. And then again, it reiterated that the term swart is defined as dirty, dark, and black. And then it states the native Germanic word surviving in the continental languages, but displaced in English by black. Also in Old English in reference to skin color or persons, okay, or skin color of persons, okay. So the word swarthy or swart was in reference to a person's skin color, and the type of skin color one most likely had when referred to as this word swarthy was anywhere from a medium brown to a very dark or what we would call today so-called black color. And so here is one last definition of the word swarthy and how it was defined. And it says, see swart, which I already read was defined to mean black and in reference to a person's skin color. And then it also says dark of complexion, black, dusky, tawny. So this definition of the word swarthy gives us a range of different words that this term could be defined as. It states swarthy could either mean black, i.e. very dark skinned, dusky, which is just another word for medium or dark brown, or a dark brown type of color. And then tawny, which can range anywhere from light brown to medium brown. So once again, the term swarthy was in fact a word that was in reference to one's complexion or skin color, and it was clearly a word that was meant to indicate a person or peoples of color. So the fact that Sir Owen Morgan stated that the term Guer Duan could also be defined as swarthy men says a lot about why the Danes were referred to in the original translation of the chronicle as black men, and the true physical appearance of these Danish Vikings that were responsible for the most significant time period in Europe's history for about an almost 300-year stretch from 793 to 1066 AD. But Sir Owen Morgan was not the only scholar of renown, or even of his time period, to refer to the Danes as a group of quote-unquote swarthy men. There were many different scholars and historians and historical writers that came to the same conclusion that I and even others like Sir Owen Morgan came to about the true physical appearance of the Danes being that of a black or swarthy complexion. So now let's take a look at some of the other historians of that time and what they had to say about the Danes. All right, so let's look at this first statement that was made by an Irish historian and antiquarian by the name of Sir John Thomas Gilbert. So let's read what he has to say regarding what the word Dub Gaul meant amongst the Irish. So the name Dub Gaul signifies literally a black or dark complexioned foreigner. Okay, so the word Dub Gaul, which of course is what the Danes were referred to as by the Irish, or by the medieval Irish, according to this Irish historian, states that the term Dub Gaul was meant to indicate someone with a black or very dark complexion, which we should already know by now. The Danes were referred to as such by not just the Irish, but also by the Welsh as well, in the form of Guer Duan. And then we can move on and take a look at another book that was written by yet another very accredited Irish historical writer by the name of Robert Alexander McAllister. So let's read what he has to say here about the Danes and their appearance. So it is worth a passing notice that the Irish chroniclers distinguished carefully between the Vikings of Denmark and those of Norway, calling them respectively the Dub Gaul, the black foreigners, and the Fiongo, the white foreigners. The Danes as a whole being of a darker complexion than the Norsemen or Norwegians. Okay, so once again, we can see here that the Danes are designated as a whole, as a people who are of a darker skin complexion as a whole than the Norwegians. Okay, so again, remember what I stated earlier about how various different chroniclers from other countries and other time periods all describe the Danes in the same way as quote unquote black heathens or Gentiles or foreigners or pagans, etc., etc. Okay, so the implication behind that term black, and what it was meant to implicate when applied to the Danes had to have applied to the entire population of the Danish Vikings as a whole. Okay, since again they were being called black by completely disparate sources who lived in completely different countries and described them as such at completely different times. But yes, once again we can see here that the Danes were referred to as being of a darker complexion people from the Norwegians, but some might say that this is just in reference to the Danes being slightly darker skinned Caucasians from the Norwegians who were just lighter skinned than them. Well, one thing that can help us understand that this was not indeed the case was the statements that were made by a very well-known Irish writer during the 19th century by the name of Sir Thomas More, who states in his History of Ireland that an army of Northmen called the Dub Gauls or Black Strangers as being of a different race from those hitherto known in Ireland, i.e. the Norwegians, having landed in considerable force in the year 850, made an attack on the Finn Gauls or white strangers already in possession of Dublin. Okay, so according to Sir Thomas More, the Danes were of a totally different race from the Norwegians or the Finn Gaul, so that right there should disprove any notion that the Danes were just darker skinned Caucasians as opposed to the Norwegians who were considerably lighter skinned than the Danes. Okay, so the Danes we've seen thus far, and as we will continue to see and much later on in this video, were indeed a people of color or so-called black people. But let's just move on and take a look at a couple more statements that were made by scholars about the Danes being an actual darker complexion group of people, which is the reasoning for why they were referred to as black no matter where they went in the British Isles. So now we're going to read this excerpt from the book entitled History of the Ancient Province of Ross, which is like a region in Scotland. So now let's take a look at what this author had to say about the Danes and their appearance. So every reader of early Irish history, so the author is starting off this paragraph by saying that every person during this time who read about the documentation of the early Irish and their contact with the Vikings knew about the things he is going to state moving forward. But let's keep reading. So is aware that the pirates who so persistently ravaged that unhappy country were composed of two kindred nationalities, the milder, fair-skinned Norwegian and the swarthy, fiercer Dane, the Dub Gauls or Black Dinars as they were termed by their victims. So right here we see that again the Danes are being contrasted with the Norwegians by their skin color. Okay, so like this author stated, pretty much everybody who read and knew about Irish history up until the point of the Viking Age at least knew that the Danes and Norwegians were called black and fair foreigners or black and fair Gentiles or pagans or strangers, etc. And they were called these things, they were called these terms because there was a difference between the two in regards to their physical appearance, which gave off the understanding and idea that was evoked by Sir Thomas More about the Danes and Norwegians being a completely distinct race, as he put it, from one another. So again, this is another author that made the same assessment that I've made over the course of this video, and really going back to the very first video series that I did on this topic, which is that the Danish Vikings, for the most part, were in fact comprised of so-called blacks. And one of the last ways I can prove this to be true, again, is by yet another name the Danes were referred to as by the Britons, who were people like the Welsh, the English, the Irish, etc. That will help us to figure out why once again the Danes were referred to as black. All right, so let's read this excerpt right here to see what other name the Danes were referred to as by the Britons. So in the Annales Cambre, the Danes are usually styled Gentiles or Gentiles Negri. Okay, so the word we want to focus on is the word Gentiles Negri or Gentiles Negri, which this excerpt right here states derives from the Annales Cambre chronicle, which I believe was a medieval Welsh historical chronicle that was also written within the time frame of the so-called Viking Age. So let's just take a look at what at that chronicle to confirm what this excerpt right here is saying is true. So here's the Annales Cambre chronicle. So let's see here where it mentions the so-called Gentiles Negri, because it mentions this word a couple of times. So the first one the first one can be seen here from the year 987 right here, where it gives that date, and it states Gotrit Filius Heradi cum Negris Gentibiris Vastavit, and I believe that translates to Gothrit, who was the son of Harold, with the black Gentiles laid waste to, and then it goes on to state what they laid waste to. But we see here that the term Negris Gentibiris, which is what the excerpt I cited from was referencing, is mentioned here, and as the excerpt stated, and as we already know, that term black Gentiles or black foreigners or black strangers, pagans, etc., was used in reference to the Danes whenever they invaded anywhere in the British Isles. So these definitely were the Danes that were being referenced here, and they are referenced again in this chronicle, and I believe the same year right here, where it states Meridat redimit captivos a Gantibiris negri, which translates to Meridat redeemed the captives from the black Gentiles. But again, we see that the Danes are being called Gentibiris negris in this chronicle, and so the importance of this word Gentibiris negris comes from its definition. The word, it derives from etymologically, and also another group of people who were also referred to as negri, who were unquestionably so-called black, which will help us understand that the Danish Vikings who ravaged the British Isles for nearly 300 years were also of this distinction, or were also of this quote-unquote ethnicity. But let's first take a look at what this term negri or negris means. So here is a Wiktionary definition of the word negri, and from this definition we can see that it states negri means to be black in color. Okay, now again, the fact that the Danes were referred to over and over again in various different ways as black, there had to have been something about them that was distinctive enough for them to have been called that term, and have that be their main form of identification. As this definition states right here, the term negri or negris, which is pretty much just the plural form of negri in Latin, so it's the same thing, but this term negri, which is what the Danes were called, meant something that is black in color. So what about the Danes could have been deemed as so-called black in color, other than a certain physical characteristic of theirs that once again was distinctive enough for them to be designated as black? And I know there will be people in the comments that will state, oh, they could have just been called black because their armor color was black, which is a load of bullshit, since pretty much all Vikings wore the same type of armor, which is known as chain mail, which is basically just a hard chain link type of armor that was for the most part silver, or really like dark silver that could have gave off the color of black, but for the most part it was just silver, or like a grayish blackish color. But for the most part, chainmail armor all look the same, which would make the name that the Norwegians were given interesting, considering that they were called Finn, or light, or white, or fair, and contrary to the Danes, who were of course so-called black. So it doesn't make much sense for the Danes to have been referred to as black because of their armor color, because again, if that's the case, the Norwegians should have been called black or dark because they were the same type of armor for the most part. So that doesn't make much sense at all whatsoever. So again, the Danes and the Norwegians had to have been called the two color names of Finn and Dub that were given to them because of a certain physical characteristic of each of these groups, and a characteristic of each of the groups that they had. And as we just saw with terms like Weir Duan, the Danes were given that name because they were of a swarthy complexion, as was stated by Sir Owen Morgan. So it's clear that whenever we see this term black being applied to the Danes by the Britons, whose land they invaded, it is in reference to their skin color. Okay, so going back to this definition of negri right here, negri meaning black in color, and the Danes being called negri should let us know that they were referred to as such because their skin color was so-called black or very dark, like the definition of this word entails. But another thing I would like to point out from this definition is the area where it gives us an understanding of where this term negri comes from. So let's scroll down and see here. So this term negri, as it states right here, is an inflection of another form of the Latin word negere. Now going back to my first series on this topic of the Black Vikings, I referenced and went into some depth about this term negere and what it means and how it was applied to people when it was used in reference to a particular person or people. But for those of you who don't know, or maybe don't remember the things that I said about this term negere, let me remind you that this term negere, when it was applied to somebody, was a word that was basically the equivalent of the term Negro that's used in the relatively modern day to refer to so-called black people. And then, of course, other words that came from this term negere words like nigga, and then even other, and then even the other word in the other form with the hard er at the end. All of those words derive from the Latin word negere, and just like those terms, negere was a word that was used to indicate that someone was what we would call today so-called black. But let's just look up a few definitions to see that this is indeed the case. All right, so let's read from this English to Latin dictionary that was written by a 17th to 18th century lexicographer by the name of Robert Ainsworth, who specialized in Latin to English translation during his lifetime. So let's see what this has to say concerning the definition of negere. So negere, negra, negrum. The first definition states black, dark, dusk. And then the second definition states one of a black or swarthy complexion. Okay, so again, this term negere, when it was applied to somebody, was a word that was used in the same way for the most part as the modern day negro or even nega. It was a word that was meant to indicate that somebody was so-called black. And as we can see from this definition here, it states that negere can be defined as someone who has a black or swarthy complexion. Now, didn't we already see the term swarthy pop up just a little bit ago from the term where duan, and not even just from that singular word, but I pulled up several sources that showcase scholars understood that the Danes were referred to as black Gentiles or foreigners and even pagans because they were simply of a swarthy or even darker complexion from the Norwegians, right? So this right here can act as a confirmation for those assertions, because again, the term that the Danes were called in the Annales Cambre chronicle, that term negri or negris derives from negere, right? And negri and or negris are defined in the same way as negere. They mean, at the very least for now, we'll speculate that they were called this because they were in fact of a quote unquote black or swarthy skin complexion, as this definition states right here. Okay, but let's just look at another Latin dictionary definition for this word negere to back this up. So this is yet another Latin dictionary written by a Latin lexicographer by the name of Nicholas Salmon. So let's see what his dictionary has to say about the word negere. And you know what? First off, I just want you guys to look at the word itself. So we see it says negere and then also negra, negrum, but then in the parentheses it states si negris here. So in other words, the way in which negere and the other forms of the word negere are defined here is applicable to negris, which of course was the word we just saw the Danish Vikings being called in the Annales Cambre chronicle, right? So the definition for negris, according to this Latin dictionary definition, can apply, the definition for negere, according to this Latin dictionary definition, can apply to negris as well. And so when we look at the definition itself, it states dark, dusk, black, of a black or swarthy complexion. So now this right here is very definitive and outright as it pertains to what this term negris was meant to imply. So it should be obvious by now why the Danes were called that term, and even the other terms that I've shown thus far in this video that translated to black. The Danes were called the so-called black Gentiles, the black foreigners, black pagans, black heathens, etc. because of their skin color. Their skin color was akin to what we would designate today as the skin color of a so-called black person. All right, that is why these groups of men were referred to as black, not because of their armor color or their banner colors or their hair color. But I just want to show one last definition of the term negere that was meant to designate a certain group of people who most will classify as so-called black or negroid. Here's the definition right here. So let's just take a look and see how this person by the name of Georges Louis Buffon, who was a French naturalist, used the term negere to classify a certain group of people that we know of today as so-called blacks or negroes. Okay, so negere, black man, black complexion, frizzly hair, flat nose, and thick lips. The whole of the inhabitants of Africa, excepting those of its northerly parts. Okay, so this person uses the exact same Latin term that the so-called Danish Vikings were referred to as by the Welsh, and he uses it to describe the so-called black Africans that inhabited most of Africa, except for the northern parts of Africa, which was talking about places like Morocco or Libya, or places like that during this time period. Those places were largely inhabited by the people who we see in those regions today, but those were not the original inhabitants of that area in Africa, in northern Africa, as I'll show a little bit later on in this video. But this little portion at the end of of this excerpt also confirms that when Niger is used in reference to somebody with quote unquote dark skin or swarthy skin, it is not talking about someone who was tan colored, since that is what the vast majority of the inhabitants of North Africa during this time period and today look like. And the author clarifies this by giving the physical features and characteristics that go along with what somebody who could be classified as Niger would have. Okay, so he says that they have a black complexion, right? We've already seen that term Niger in its other forms as well as Negra, Negrom, and even the exact same term the Danish Vikings were called, which was Negris, was meant to imply that someone was or even a group of people had black or swarthy complexion, right? So this definition of Niger is in alignment with the previous Latin dictionaries I just showed. And not only that, but the other features like the frizzy hair, or what we would call quote unquote nappy hair, right? And then the flat nose, the thick lips, all those features are characteristic of a so-called black person, right? So now it should hopefully become more visceral in some of you guys' heads what a lot of these black Vikings looked like, and even more importantly, what they didn't look like. Okay, this right here is the image of a Viking that most of us are given, some disheveled looking Caucasian man with blonde or red hair, blue eyes, and pale skin, but this is not how they were described by actual people who saw them in person. The Welsh, Irish, Scottish, English, etc. all describe the Vikings as so-called black or even swarthy complexioned people, who most likely had the same type of features this definition of Niger gives us. So now your view of what a so-called Viking looked like can be shifted from this to this. This by far and away is a more accurate portrayal of what a real Viking looked like at the time, at least amongst the Danes, because again, like I stated earlier in the video, there were Caucasian Vikings. I've referenced them all throughout this video, and their existence, they were documented by the Irish and the Welsh chronicles as being Fionn or white foreigners, okay? So they did exist, but the entire Viking/Scandinavian population was not all white-skinned Caucasian with blonde hair and blue eyes. Most of the major raiding parties of Danish as well as Swedish Vikings were comprised of so-called black men, and that is just a fact. But in case people still don't believe this to be true, let's keep going with this term Niger so that we can see even more definitively that these groups of Vikings were indeed so-called black. There may still be some people who say that the Vikings were given the designation of Niger or Negris because of their hair color, even though in none of the Latin dictionaries I cited from did the word Niger translate to black hair. They all apply to the complexion of whoever that term was given to. So let's just look at some examples of people who were also called Niger and had that term applied to them because of their complexion, just like the Danish Vikings had that term applied to them because of their complexion as well. So before we look at these examples I'm going to show, I just want to give you guys just one more example of the background of this term Niger and how it was applied to people who were called this term. So this is going to come from a Scottish antiquarian by the name of Sir Robert Sebald. So let's read what he has to say concerning what this term Niger meant when it was applied to someone. So I shall only remark hereupon the name Duff, that as Niger and Rufus were names of families amongst the Romans from the color and complexion of men, so it seems Duff was from the swarthy and black color of the tribe. So again, Niger was a word that applied to the complexion of an individual or a group of people. Okay, it didn't have anything to do with hair color or any other feature that was on someone. It applied to their complexion. So now let's look at some examples of figures in history and mythology that were referred to as Niger. And the first one we'll take a look at is the legendary figure from Homer's Iliad who ruled over the land of Ethiopia. I've done a video on this man before. His name was Memnon. And just as an aside, this will probably be something that I may or may not get into in this series, but we'll see it as I move along with the videos, and once I get through the videos that I want to go over first. But the pantheon of Norse so-called gods and goddesses, or as they're more conventionally known as the Aesir, according to the Icelandic historian and poet Snorri Sturluson, who wrote basically the equivalent of the Iliad for the Norse in the Prose Edda, and then even the older or Elder Edda. And in those books, he states that figures like Thor was actually the son of Memnon, and that the other Norse mythological figures like Odin and Freya and Frigga, Freyr, etc. were actually descended from the Trojans. And for those of you who don't know, the Trojans were so-called black, as is evidenced by Memnon himself, who was stated to have been a so-called black man, and he was of Trojan lineage. Okay, but again, you guys can go and check that video out on Memnon to see more of that if you want to. And I may or may not talk about this topic, how the Assyr and the Trojans relate to each other in this series, but I will for sure get to it later on down the line. But anyway, yes, Memnon was a so-called black man, and the evidence of this comes from one of the words that was used to describe him by a Roman poet who wrote kind of his own version of the Iliad, which was a very common thing amongst the Roman poets and playwrights of that time to do. But anyway, let's look real quick and see what the Roman poet Virgil uses, what word the Roman poet Virgil uses to describe Memnon. So Memnon was black, and then what was the word that Virgil used to describe him as being so-called black? He used the word negri, as this excerpt states, and then the author goes about citing where in the Aeneid poem that Virgil created, Memnon was referred to as such. But anyway, once again, we see here that the term negri being used in reference to a so-called black figure who was what we would call today a Negro or a black person. Okay, that term negri was used to refer to a so-called black person. And again, this is what the term that was given to the Danish Vikings by the Welsh chroniclers during the Viking Age. And just in case you guys need a visual of what Memnon being called negri means, here is a 520 BC vase that was made of Memnon. Here he is the man in the center of the two so-called Caucasians, and this obviously without a doubt depicts a so-called black man. Okay, he has the same complexion we saw the term negir be defined to entail when describing someone's physical characteristics had, right? So once again, that term negir applied to the complexion of someone, and nothing else. And then here is just one last image of Memnon that was created at a much later date during the early to mid 1700s, I believe. But the sentiment was still the same about Memnon, which was that he was a so-called black man, and we can clearly see that. And we can clearly see that in the facial features that are displayed here, even though his face is turned slightly to the side. You can still see the same physical characteristics that we saw being described by the very last definition of negir that I showed, where it stated that someone who was referred to as negir was a person with frizzy or nappy curly hair, which he's depicted with right here, thick lips and a flat nose. This photo of Memnon pretty much includes all of those physical characteristics. And when you compound that with the complexion he was described as having and depicted having, you can clearly see that he was indeed a so-called black man. And this only proves that once again, the term negri or negris, which derived from negir, means someone or an entire group of people, i.e. the quote-unquote Danish Vikings were so-called black men. Okay, but another example I want to show actually comes from the scriptures from Acts the 13th chapter, around about the first verse. And in that verse, there is a man who was called Simeon or Simon, but next to his name, the term negir can be seen very clearly. So let's go about seeing what this term negir meant in reference to Simeon negir to see if again the word was applied to him because of his skin color. So now let's read this book that was written by John Locke. Some of you may have heard of him before in your history classes when you were younger, but just in case you don't know, John Locke was one of the premier quote-unquote Enlightenment thinkers during the Age of Enlightenment time period. And he, along with a well-known English priest by the name of William Dodd, wrote this commentary on the books of the Old and the New Testaments. So let's read what they had to say regarding the reasoning for why Simeon from Acts the 13th chapter was given this name Negir. So starting at some have conjectured that Negir, mentioned in this verse, was Simeon the Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was compelled to bear the cross after Christ. For it is very probable that he was called Negir as being of a tawny or black complexion, as the Africans generally are. Okay, so again, we see that the term Negir not only was juxtaposed with having a so-called black complexion, but also with someone being identified as a so-called African, which was basically the designation that most scholars were starting to ascribe to so-called black people during this time period. But either way, the term Negir is once again linked with so-called black people, which should show beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Vikings were given this name of Negri and Negris because they were in fact so-called black people, or what we would think of today when we think of so-called black people. So once again, a photo like this depicts, of course, a person posing as a Viking and not an actual Viking figure, but this image right here is by far and away the most accurate portrayal of what a lot of the original Scandinavian Vikings looked like, especially the Danes and a lot of the Swedes. So there should be no more question that this is indeed the case. But if you still want to deny this as the truth, because believe me, I get it. The way we're taught when it comes to history and who was who in history, not just in our history classes as children, and not even and even when we're in college, but also in pop culture as well, and which can have just as big of an influence on our overall outlook on things from a historical standpoint. Because when you think about it, most people aren't going to want to take the time out to research and read about things and look deeper into subjects like this concerning the real appearance of the Vikings and who they actually were in history. Most people will probably just want to watch a movie like The Northman that just recently came out a couple of years ago, that very accurately portrays Scandinavian society, by the way. But movies like that, and even television shows like the Viking show on AMC, as well as video games and other forms of pop culture, portray the Vikings as looking the same. They portray all of the people of Scandinavia as the same too, as so-called Caucasians with pale skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes, right? So again, it's understandable why people might be skeptical of the things that I am trying to state in this video, because of a lot of the programming that's been imparted upon people in general. But in reality, using the Northman movie, for example, the main character, Amleth, he should have been portrayed as a so-called black man, because in real life, the figure known to history as Amleth was a Danish prince. And we've already seen how the Danes were described, right? So yes, that main character, who was portrayed by, I believe, Alexander Skarsgård, of course, a so-called Caucasian man, should have been portrayed by a so-called black actor like a Michael B. Jordan or even a Jonathan Majors or something like that, or somebody like that. Somebody like that should have been portraying Amleth in that movie, believe it or not. And even in the show The Vikings, as we're about to see in the next video from this series, the vast majority of those characters in that show in real life were so-called black. Okay, yes, Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Jorn Ironside, all those guys were so-called black men in real life. But again, I'll show that more in the next video from this series. But once again, most people will not even conceive that the things that I'm saying are indeed the truth, but this just happens to be the case. And for those of you who, again, still don't believe me, let me just go about showing a couple more examples that will prove my point even further before we close this video out and move on to the next thing. So the word negri or negir, as we have already been able to ascertain, was a word that meant black and almost always referred to somebody's skin color. Okay, we've seen a couple of examples of individual figures that were referred to as negir or even negri, but we haven't seen an entire group of people be referred to as negri or negris like the Vikings. The Vikings, of course, invaded the British Isles in groups comprised of 1,000, 2,000, and even as much as 3,000 or more men. So these were a very large group of Viking raiders that were coming into the British Isles and pillaging the Britons' homelands. So in order to get a proper evaluation of how the terms negir, negri, and negris could apply to an entire population, let's take a look at an example of a group of people that many today are split on when it comes to the identification of the ethnic origins of this race or this group of people. This conglomerate that I am referring to are known to history as the Moors, and for a lot of us who are in the knowledge, we already know that the Moors what the Moors truly looked like based off of how they were depicted in real history. But just like the Vikings, the Moors are by some people vehemently denied as being so-called black in history. And like I said, their ethnic origin is the cause for much debate amongst most people. But that topic on the Moors will be for another day or for another video series down the line. But one thing the Moors can help us do is figure out who the Vikings were according to the same people who gave them the name Dubgal or black foreigners. The Irish annalists of the medieval time period spoke about a scuffle that occurred between the Vikings and the so-called Moors, or peoples of North Africa, which could be referred to as Mauritania. The land of North Africa back then was referred to as Mauritania. And the way in which they describe the complexion of the Moors is eerily similar, if not just outright the exact same, as how the Welsh described the Vikings, and even how the Irish described the Vikings, using the same exact word they did in their accounts pertaining to the Scandinavian pirates. So let's just take a look at a fragmentary piece from the Annals of Ireland that is cited from by this book. And so let's read what this has to say here. So the prime piece of evidence we have of direct contact between Muslims and the Irish is an entry from the so-called fragmentary Annals of Ireland, which Smith describes as the Irish version of Ragnar's saga. Okay, so this first sentence right here establishes the authenticity of this article I'm about to cite from. So this is a very valid source of evidence. So, but anyway, two of Ragnar's sons set out from Ireland to plunder Muslim Spain and then move on to North Africa, where the where they confront the Mauritanians in a pitched battle. So now let's read the translation of the Irish medieval annal fragment. So the Norwegians swept across the country and they devastated and burned the whole land. They brought a great host of them captured with them to Ireland, i.e. those are the black men, literally blue men. And remember this term blue men for later on. But for Mori is the same as Negri. Mauritania is the same as Negritando. Hardly 1 in 3 of the Norwegians escaped between those who were slain and those who were drowned in the Gaditian Straits. Now those black men remained in Ireland for a long time, and then we'll stop right here. So, but now there are a couple of things. There are a couple of things here that can be gleaned from this passage. First of all, remember that word Mori and its connection with Negri that this fragment from this medieval chronicle gives us, because that is going to be very important to keep in mind and to keep track of moving forward in the closing stages of this video. But secondly, the very last sentence shows us that a group of quote-unquote black men remained in Ireland for a very long time. Now, the so-called black men that this passage is referring to are not the Danes, but as we've seen over and over again, this was a name that was given to them, especially if you remember in the form of Guer Douan, which quite literally translates to the black men and is quite literally a coincidence, or that's quite a coincidence that the North Africans in this passage are also described as so-called black men as well, just like the Danes were described as so-called black men just by an entirely group of people in the Welsh. But the word black, the word black men here is of course referring to the people of North Africa or Mauritania that were being taken away from their land by the Vikings from Ireland. And the term black men that was applied to them, of course, as we should know, was in reference to their complexion. But since there are once again certain people who may say no to this because they believe the Moors were just a group of quote unquote North African Berbers and not so-called black people, let's just take a look at another source that can prove them being called black because of their complexion to be true. So let's read this excerpt right here, which will give us a better understanding of why the North Africans were referred to as Negri and why that term Mori was correlated with Negri. So the term Mauritania is derived from an adjective that means of or pertaining to the Moors. It comes from the ancient Greek word moros, moras, in Latin meaning dark. Romans called the northwestern Africa Mauritania and its inhabitants Mori, Moor in English. And again, pay attention to that term Mori because we're going to go over it in a little bit here. So, but their complexion received frequent notice as they were described as Negri, black, and Adjustee, scorched. So we see here that the term Negri, as it was applied to the Moors or the Mauritanians, was a word that was given to them because of their complexion being so-called black. And as we've seen time and time again in this video, from the evidence that I've been able to show from Latin dictionaries and the previous 2 examples I displayed, the terms Negri, Negris, and Negir were always in reference to complexion. So again, whenever Negri is applied to somebody or a group of people, it is talking about their skin color being black. So now that that is out of the way, I want to highlight the other word I accentuated besides Negri, the word Mori. And the reason why I want to put an emphasis on this word and examine it more in depth is because it will give us an even better understanding of what the term Negri meant. Because I'm looking back at the first example I showed from the Irish medieval fragment where it stated that Mori and Negri were the same thing, right? So that basically means that the same definition that we've seen already for Negri and Negir can apply to Mori and vice versa. So now let's just take a look at what this term Mori meant real quick here. So one of the main ways we can gain an understanding of the definition for the term Mori is by seeing what word derived from this Latin term. The term Mori that I'm talking about, it is a Latin term, but one of the ways we can figure out what Mori meant and what type of people it is connected to is by seeing what English word we use today to describe a certain group of people in history came from this term Mori. So let's start out first by looking at the New World Encyclopedia website here to see what word derived from this term Mori. So Moor. Okay, so the term we see here that derives from Mori is Moor, but let's read further to confirm this to be true. So Moor comes from the Greek word moros, plural meori, and meaning black or very dark, which in Latin became moro, plural mori. Okay, so once again, we see here that the term Moor does indeed derive from the word Mori, and this excerpt gives us an idea of what the term Moor and its ancient Greek form was meant to denote, that being something or someone being black or very dark in most instances in complexion. Okay, and I've already gone over the term Moor on this channel a number of times. I've already been able to prove that this term meant in the Middle Ages all the way down onto Shakespeare's time period, around the Renaissance time period, during his era where he wrote plays. But the term Moor in the Middle Ages all the way to the Renaissance time period was basically a synonym for a Negro or a so-called black person. And really the term Moor was a synonym for that specific demographic going all the way back to antiquity, when it was used in the aforementioned form of moros in the ancient Greek language. But yes, this term Moor was a word that meant a so-called black person, which would mean that its predecessor, the term Mori, also meant the same thing, which is why it was used to describe the Moors of North Africa, who themselves were so-called black. But we'll see more of that in a little bit here. But looking at the term Mori, this should help us figure out what the term Negri was meant to entail, since as the Irish medieval fragment from 877 states, Mori is the same as Negri. So the terms Mori and Negri are basically congruent with one another in terms of what they're meant to imply and how they were used to describe people. And of course, this ties back to the term that the Danes were described as in the Annales Cambrai Chronicle, where they were said to be as a collective negris, which is just the Latin plural form of the word negri. Okay, so with that being said, we can now come to the conclusion that the term negris, as it was applied to the Danish Vikings who were raiding the Welsh and the entirety of the British Isles at the time, were called this term negris because, for all intents and purposes, they were a group of so-called blacks or Negroes, just as that term negri was which is an equivalent to the term Mori, the Latin antecedent of the word Moor, which once again during the Middle Ages was just a synonym for a so-called black person or Negro. But if you still don't believe me, I'll go about showing a few examples of what this term Moor or Mori meant and who it was applied to during the Middle Ages. Alright, so this is the website I always like to refer to when doing a breakdown of the word Moor, because it gives the best description of what that term was meant to indicate during the Middle Ages. So let's just read what this has to say. And we can see at the very top paragraph of this definition, it gives the etymological origin of the word Moor as the ancient Greek moros, which meant black. Okay, so moros meant black, most likely a term that applied to the skin color of the people it applied to. But moving down, it states, also applied to the Arabic conquerors of Spain, being a dark people in relation to Europeans. Their name in the Middle Ages was a synonym for a Negro. Okay, so the term Moor in the Middle Ages, like etymology.com states, was a synonym for a Negro, which we should already know is just another word for a so-called black person. So again, the term Moor, Mori, whichever one you want to use, during the Middle Ages, which was the time when the so-called Vikings existed and underwent their campaigns against the people of Europe during the Middle Ages, that term Moor meant a so-called black person. So when that term Mori is equated to Negri, and the Vikings were called by the name of Negri or Negris, we should have an understanding by now of what those terms, specifically Negri, were meant to denote in terms of the physical appearance of the so-called Danish Vikings, who we've seen at every turn be called black by multiple different accounts. But just to double down on this, I'm going to show one more example of this term Mori or Moor, how it was used to denote a so-called black person going all the way back to antiquity as well. So let's see that real quick here. So let's read this rendition of the ancient Roman poet Martial from his most famous work, Martial's Epigrams. And in this excerpt, we're going to read what the annotator of this work states about what was meant to be gleaned from the use of the word Moor or Mortis, as it was called during the ancient Roman era. So let's see what this has to say. So Morris, a name of Mauritania, Moor, here is synonym for Ethiops equals Negro. So yes, even during the ancient Roman time period, Moor or Moris was a word that was meant to denote a so-called black person. Okay, so we should get the point by now with all that, and we should be able to identify that this term Moor or what this term Moor means as it pertains to the people that it was applied to. And in turn, of course, this should give us an understanding of what Negri meant when it was applied to someone or an entire group of people in the form of Negris. So there's that. But you know what? The Vikings themselves actually had a term for the so-called Moors or North Africans. The word they used to describe the North Africans is in direct alignment with what this term Moor meant during the Middle Ages, according to the sources we've seen thus far. So let's take a look at what this word was. So now let's read this excerpt from a book that was written by a Scottish historian named Alan Orr Anderson. So let's read. So after that, the Scandinavians went through the country and ravaged it, and they burned the whole land, and they brought a great host of the Moors in captivity with them to Ireland. These are the blue men, because Moors are the same as Negroes. Mauritania is the same as Negro land. And when you look down, he actually cites a piece of the original translation of the Irish Chronicle I cited earlier that equated Mori to Negri, and how the land of Mauritania was equivalent to Negro land or Negritondo. So once again, Negri and Mori are basically the same exact word, just in different forms. But from this excerpt, I want to mainly focus on the word this author mentions, which is blue men. The Vikings pronounce this term blue men as blah men in their native tongue. And as this excerpt states, these so-called blue men were actually so-called black men. The term blue during the ancient times to antiquity and during the medieval time period, as we see here with the Vikings, was actually a word that meant dark or black or some sort of dark color. It didn't oftentimes mean what we think of it today when we think of the color blue. But that will be another story for another day, because it will be important to go over when I talk about the Germanic tribes and how their physical characteristics were described, or I should say mistranslated to push a certain narrative. But again, that will be for another day. But going back to the term blah men, yes, it was a word that was meant to indicate a so-called black person. But let's just see a few examples of that real quick here. Now we're looking at this Wiktionary definition of blah men. So we see at the top blah men, and then it goes on to say that the Scandinavian word blah meant blue. And before I move on, I just want to let you guys know that this term blah will be very important to remember for my next video when I go over the descendants of a certain legendary Viking figure in history whose descendant who was a very well-known and essential figure in Scandinavian history, especially during their history converting over to Christianity. But this figure was referred to as a blah or blue man during his lifetime. But that will be for the next video. But just getting back to what this states right here, blah means blue, and then of course man just means man, and then it goes over the various forms of blah man from the Old Swedish to Icelandic to Danish and Norwegian. So now let's go down a little bit further and take a look at blah men as a noun. And as we can see, it states that as a noun, blah men meant a black person, okay, a so-called black person, or as we just saw, a Negro, a person that we would identify today as so-called black or so-called African American. So once again, blah men meant a so-called black person. But something else that is interesting about this definition is the synonyms Wiktionary gives us for blah men. And we see down here that the synonyms for this word are Niger or Niger and Svarting. Now that term Niger is yet another form of the Latin word Niger that I've gone over throughout this portion of the video. And of course, we should know that Niger is the original form of Negri and Negris, right? So yet again, we see the parallels that exist between the word that the Welsh used to describe the so-called Vikings and other words that were quite literally meant to indicate a so-called black person or so-called black people as a group. With all of this evidence that I've shown thus far, I don't really see how it can be denied anymore that the real physical appearance of a lot of, if not most of the Vikings who were raiding the British Isles were during the Viking Age and what they looked like. Okay, but we're just going to keep going. We're just going to keep on going and look at a couple more definitions for blah men real quick here. So this is an online Icelandic dictionary, I believe. So let's see what this gives us in regards to the definition of blah men. So we see blah men, and then it states black person, Negro of people from various parts of Africa. So again, the blah men, or as the Irish would call them, Mori, were Negroes or so-called black men. And then just one more piece of evidence here, straight from this annotated version of a book that was written by the legendary Icelandic poet Snorri Sturluson. Let's see what this has to say here about the term blah men. So blah land equals where the Negroes live in Africa. The Negroes are called in the OS, which is a Viking saga. Blah men equals blue men. Okay, so once again, the term blue men, which was applied to the Mori or Moors, was a term that indicated a Negro or so-called black person. So we should get the point by now. The term Mori, which means the same thing as the word Negri, which of course was the word that the Vikings were called by the Welsh in the form of being called Negris Gentibiris or Negri Gentis or even Negra Gens, was a term that was meant to indicate a so-called black person or a Negro. And so in turn, this of course is what the Danish Vikings were referred to as, because they too were Negroes or so-called black people, okay? So the Danes, they were black people, and in case it's hard to visualize what these Moris or Negris would have or could have looked like, I'll show a few images of how they were depicted during the medieval time period. So here's an image of some Moris or Negris playing chess, obviously being shown as so-called black men. And then here is an alleged depiction of the Apostle Matthew preaching the gospel to the so-called Moors or Mori or Negris, and again they are clearly shown as so-called black. And then here is yet another depiction of Moris or Negris playing chess with alleged so-called European Christians. And then this is one last image that I'll show of the German tapestry that depicts the Moors and the so-called wild men. I did a video on a while ago that you guys can go ahead and check out. But we can see here the Moors or Moris are depicted with black skin and are obviously Negroes, just as the term Moor was meant to entail somebody was during the Middle Ages. Or during the medieval time period. So we get the point. Again, the term Mori, which was meant to indicate that someone was a Moor or a Negro, is the same as Negri or Negris, which also indicated someone as a Negro or so-called black person. And with this being the word that was applied to the Vikings, along with all the other words we've seen, like Werduan, which meant the black or swarthy men, and even Dub Gal, Dub Genti, Dub Laklan, so on and so forth, it was a word that was meant to, beyond a shadow of a doubt, indicate that the Danish Vikings were so-called black men, okay? So as we should know definitively by now, the Danes were indeed so-called blacks, and most likely would have looked like a lot of the images I showed of the Moors. But the final question I want to answer before I close this video out is if there is an actual visual representation of what these so-called Danish Vikings looked like that can give us somewhat of an accurate understanding of what they really truly looked like. Well, the answer to that question is that there is, but in order to understand the proper context behind this image I'm about to show, we should first take a look a little bit further down the Viking age at an event that will impact the rest of the time I talk about the medieval time period, specifically in England, but also eventually in other parts of the British Isles. The descendants of these same Danish Vikings ruled over from about the middle of the Viking Age in the 800s AD to the mid to late 1700s, going into the 1800s. And this event is what kickstarted the peoples we know of today in history as the Normans, who came to inhabit the Duchy of Normandy in and around 911 AD after decades of attempting to raid and take over the country of France from the Frankish Holy Roman Empire from I believe about 885 to 886 AD to around 911 AD. And even after 911, the Vikings raided and pillaged the country of France, especially in an area in medieval France known as Brittany. And the main groups of Scandinavians, including their leader, who will go on to become the ancestor of damn near every king and queen of England, parts of France, and then even later on England, Scotland, Ireland, and the Prince of Wales, who went by the name of Rollo. They were all of those people who were all of Danish origin. But before we see this depiction of what these Danes that raided France from the mid 9th century AD to the 10th century AD looked like, let's go about seeing that what I'm saying is true pertaining to the main group of Vikings within Rollo's army being Danish, since there is a lot of conjecture as to the specific type of Scandinavians who were involved in the taking over of Normandy. So let's see that real quick here. So first, we'll read from this very well-known and excellent work on the Vikings that was done by the Welsh professor Gwyn Jones. So let's see what he has to say here regarding the identity of these Vikings who were raiding France. So on the scene of action itself, Rollo was considered to be a Dane. And this is yet another controversial topic that I'm going to get into when I speak about the Normans in my next video series, which is the nationality of Rollo and whether or not he was a Dane or a Norwegian. Even though when you just do rudimentary research and use deductive reasoning about things such as who the main population of his army was comprised of, it becomes very easy to understand that Rollo was indeed Danish. And again, that identity of him having Danish origins will have an impact on how we figure out what the Norman kings like William the Conqueror, William II or William Rufus, his brothers Robert Curthose and Henry I, as well as the Plantagenet kings and queens and the Tudor kings and queens and even the Stuart kings and queens look like as we move forward discussing this time period in history. So this identity is very, very important in order for us to prove that the royalty during medieval Europe up until the up until the end of the Renaissance time period were so-called black. But that will be for another day. But reading on, much of the evidence on both sides is obviously unreliable. The main Danish authority is the notorious Dudo, but the nationality of the leader is less important than that of his army, which there is every reason to believe was predominantly Danish. Okay, so this highly renowned Welsh historian, scholar, and professor Gwyn Jones states that it is without question that the peoples who helped invade France with Rollo were predominantly of Danish origin, okay? And we should obviously know by now how the Danes were described and what they looked like, right? And in a minute, we'll see what they looked like too, but let's read one more source to corroborate this as true. So this is a book written by a British archaeologist and art historian by the name of Sir Thomas T. Kendrick. And so let's just see what he has to say about the nationality of the Vikings who were with Rollo. And it must be held, therefore, as most likely, though not proven with certainty, that Rollo was Norwegian, which is not true. But again, we'll speak about this more in depth in the next series. But whether he was Norwegian or Danish, there can be no doubt that the bulk of the army he commanded was composed of Danish Vikings. Okay, so once again, the main group of Vikings that went with Rollo during his famous raids in France, like the siege of Paris in 885 to 886, and eventually the battle that led to a document known as the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, which was a treaty that gave the Duchy of Normandy over to Rollo and his army in 911 after they failed to lay siege to the land of Chartres and were granted the permission to own Normandy by Charles the Simple of the Holy Roman Empire in exchange for their loyalty to him. Okay, so now that we know that these were Danish Vikings that went along with Rollo into France, let's see what these Danes looked like who helped Rollo raid another area in France known as Brittany, specifically the area in Brittany known as Grenade, where the Vikings laid siege to it in 919 AD. Let's see how they were depicted. Okay, so this right here is what the Danish Dub Gaul, Dub Genti, Negri Vikings looked like who raided Grenade, Brittany in 919 AD. This image comes from a manuscript that was made in and around 1050 to 1100 AD. So a little bit after that event, is what's being illustrated as happening. But this image is without a doubt an accurate representation of what the Danes, who we've seen at every turn, but almost every single British Isles country they raided, who documented their raids and what they looked like, were described as black. So now it should be conclusive as to what their physical appearance was, or their true physical appearance was. They were unquestionably so-called blacks, as this image of them clearly shows them to be. Okay, and this image right here is going to be one of the utmost importance for you guys to remember, and I'll even show it over and over again when I do my series on the Normans, because again, the Normans, particularly the legendary William the Conqueror, had an impact on what the physical appearance of the vast majority of the rulers in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, as well as France and other areas in Europe looked like from 1066 on down. These men here are not only what the Danes looked like, but they were the ancestors of the Normans and of the Dukes of Normandy, like William Longsword, Richard I, Richard II, Robert III, Robert I, all the way on down to William the Conqueror and his descendants. And then from them sprang forth William the Conqueror sprang forth after them. And then after William the Conqueror, rulers like Henry II of England and his sons, the legendary Richard the Lionheart and the infamous King John of Lackland, who precipitated the creation of the Magna Carta, on down to Edward I, the II, and the legendary King Edward III, who I already showed a couple of times on this channel and proved that he himself was a so-called black man. But on down to Richard II, and then after him, the houses of Lancaster and York, who spent a 30-year-long war known as the War of Roses, fighting over who had the right to take over the English throne, only for it to be eventually taken over by Henry VII of the Welsh/Norman Tudor dynasty. And then from him, of course, sprung forth the world-famous King Henry VIII and his son Edward VI, and then later on the legendary Queen Elizabeth I. And then after her, of course, we have the man who most brothers in the knowledge already know was a so-called black man in King James VI/I, and from him sprung forth the King Charles I of England and his two sons, King James VII and II, and the man who was literally called black a multitude of times throughout his life, literally from his birth, King Charles II. And then after the reign of Queen Anne is when the Norman line started to die out, even though it still lived on somewhat in the Hanoverians with guys like King George I, II, and III. But all of those kings and queens that I just named all sprung forth from people who look like this today, who look like this. Okay, so all those men I listed and the many others that we'll go over, those were all so-called black people. Okay, and that is why I started out this medieval time period series talking about the Vikings, because they really do have an essential impact on not just European history or history in general, but on so-called black people's history. Yes, I said it's so-called black people's history as well, because these are our ancestors. All right, but all of that is what's going to be in store in this series on the medieval time period. But that will conclude this video, and in the next video we'll take a look at what the descendants of the ever famous and well-known Vikings figure Ragnar Lothbrok looked like, as well as what he himself looked like, because it sure as hell ain't what is portrayed in that trash show of the Vikings on AMC. So we'll see that in the next video.